An elderly man with Alzheimer's rescues a pit bull that was suffering on the streets, and what the dog did next left everyone in shock. Before the story begins, comment below which city you're watching this video from. Don't forget to subscribe to the channel and leave a like. Enjoy the story, everyone. The quiet of Frank Wilson's modest home in the outskirts of Oak Ridge, Pennsylvania, was almost tangible. At 78, Frank had grown accustomed to silence, to the empty spaces where Eleanor's voice once filled the rooms with warmth and laughter. 5 years had passed since he'd lost her to cancer, but sometimes when the house creaked a certain way, he'd turn, expecting to see her standing there with that gentle smile of hers. Today, like most days, Frank sat in his worn leather armchair by the window, watching raindrops race down the glass. His weathered hands clutched a faded photograph. Eleanor, on their 40th anniversary, her silver hair gleaming in the sunlight, her blue eyes crinkling at the corners. He traced the outline of her face with his thumb, a ritual that brought both comfort and pain. "Did I eat lunch today?" Frank muttered to himself, glancing toward the kitchen. He couldn't remember. These lapses were becoming more frequent since his Alzheimer's diagnosis 3 years ago. The doctors had warned him about the progression, how memories would slip away like water through cupped hands, how familiar faces would become strangers, how routine tasks would transform into puzzles. Frank pushed himself up from the chair, his joints protesting with each movement. The kitchen counter held no clues, no dirty dishes, no leftover food. He opened the refrigerator, staring at its sparse contents: half a gallon of milk, some eggs, a few containers of ready-made meals his neighbor Sarah occasionally brought over. "Maybe I did eat," he said to the empty room, then chuckled without humor. "Or maybe I forgot to be hungry." Outside, the summer rain intensified, drumming against the roof of the small ranch-style house Frank had purchased with Eleanor 42 years ago. Back then, they'd had dreams of filling it with children, with noise and chaos and love. Life had other plans. Eleanor's difficult pregnancy had ended in heartbreak, and subsequent attempts proved unsuccessful. They'd made peace with it eventually, building a life around each other, finding joy in simpler things: gardening, community service, quiet evenings on the porch, watching fireflies dance in the gathering darkness. Now Frank wandered from room to room, touching familiar objects as if to anchor himself to reality. The grandfather clock in the hallway, a wedding gift from Eleanor's parents, the collection of hand-carved wooden birds on the mantelpiece, his own handiwork from happier days when his hands were steady and his mind was sharp. The bookshelf filled with mysteries Eleanor had loved, each spine cracked from multiple readings. Frank's daily routine had narrowed to a few basic activities: waking up, taking his medications, when he remembered, watching the news, attempting small meals, and sitting by the window. Occasionally, Sarah Finley from next door would check in, bringing casseroles and concern in equal measure. Dr. Peterson would call once a week, and his nephew Mike visited monthly, though these visits had become increasingly uncomfortable as Frank struggled to recognize the young man who was his only living relative. "Mr. Wilson, Frank, are you home?" Sarah's voice called from the front door, followed by a gentle knocking. Frank had forgotten she was coming today. "Coming," he called, making his way slowly to the entrance. Sarah stood on the porch, rain dripping from her umbrella, a Tupperware container in her hands. At 65, she was a widow herself, her kind face framed by short grey curls. She'd been Eleanor's friend for decades, and after Eleanor's passing, she'd appointed herself Frank's unofficial guardian. "I brought some beef stew," she said, stepping inside and shaking out her umbrella. "Here's getting chilly with all this rain." "You shouldn't trouble yourself," Frank said, the same response he always gave. Sarah ignored him, moving comfortably through his kitchen, placing the container in the refrigerator. "Have you taken your medication today?" she asked, eyeing the pill organizer on the counter. Frank hesitated. Had he? The morning compartment was empty, but he couldn't recall actually swallowing the pills. "I think so," he said finally. Sarah's expression softened. "Let's make sure," she said, checking the organizer more closely. "Looks like you did take the morning dose. Good job." The praise made Frank feel like a child, but he nodded anyway, grateful for her help despite his embarrassment. "Dr. Peterson called me," Sarah continued, filling Frank's kettle with water for tea. "He said you missed your appointment yesterday." Frank frowned. "I don't remember any appointment." "It was on your calendar," Sarah said gently, pointing to the large print wall calendar where Dr. P. Tuazuz was clearly written on yesterday's date. Oh, Frank felt a familiar wave of frustration and fear. Another moment lost, another failure, another sign of his mind betraying him. I'm sorry. Don't apologize. We rescheduled for next week. I'll drive you. They sat at the small kitchen table, steam rising from their mugs of tea. Sarah chatted about neighborhood happenings, the Johnsons' new grandchild, the roadwork on Main Street, the upcoming community fair. Frank nodded at appropriate intervals, though he struggled to keep track of the names and events. After Sarah left, promising to return tomorrow, Frank stood at the window again, watching her hurry through the rain to her house next door. The loneliness settled back around his shoulders like a heavy cloak. He knew Sarah meant well, that her visits were born of genuine concern, but they also served as painful reminders of his decline, of the burden he was becoming. I won't be a burden, he'd promised Eleanor in the hospital during her final days. I'll take care of myself, Ellie. Don't you worry about me. He'd meant it then. Now, as his mind frayed at the edges, that promise seemed impossible to keep. The rain continued throughout the afternoon, matching Frank's somber mood. He dozed in his chair, waking with a start, when a particularly loud thunderclap shook the windows. Disoriented, he called out, "Eleanor!" before reality settled back in. Frank shuffled to the bathroom, avoiding his reflection in the mirror. He'd stopped recognizing himself some time ago. This thin, stooped old man with cloudy blue eyes and wispy white hair couldn't possibly be the same Frank Wilson who had once built houses, who had danced with Eleanor under summer stars, who had known exactly who he was and what purpose he served in the world. As evening approached, Frank heated Sarah's stew in the microwave, careful to remove the metal spoon she'd accidentally left in the container. He ate mechanically at the kitchen table, barely tasting the food. The house creaked and settled around him, its sounds familiar yet somehow threatening in their emptiness. Later, as Frank prepared for bed, following the checklist Sarah had taped to his bathroom mirror, brush teeth, take evening pills, set alarm, he paused at the window. The rain had finally stopped, leaving behind a glistening world under the emerging moon. For a moment, looking at the silvery light painting his backyard, Frank felt a curious peace. Then it was gone, replaced by the ever-present confusion and the nagging sense that he was forgetting something important. In bed, Frank placed Eleanor's photograph on the nightstand where he could see it. "Good night, Ellie," he whispered, a nightly ritual that provided some comfort in the vast silence of his existence. As sleep began to claim him, Frank couldn't know that tomorrow would bring an unexpected visitor who would transform his lonely life in ways he could never imagine. That somewhere in the rainy night, destiny was already making its way toward his door, carrying with it the possibility of redemption, purpose, and an unlikely friendship that would challenge the boundaries of companionship and loyalty. Morning arrived with hesitant sunshine filtering through the clouds. Frank awoke disoriented, as he often did, momentarily unsure of where or when he was. The bedside photograph of Eleanor anchored him back to reality. He reached for it, pressing it briefly to his chest before beginning his daily struggle against confusion. The list on his bathroom mirror grounded him. Morning pills, breakfast, check the calendar. Today's square was blank. No appointments, no visitors scheduled. Just another empty day stretching before him like an endless road. Frank made himself toast and coffee, concentrating hard on each step to avoid mistakes. Last month he'd left the stove on, and only Sarah's timely visit had prevented a potential disaster. Since then, he'd limited his cooking to the toaster and microwave, mourning yet another piece of independence lost to his condition. After breakfast, Frank settled into his usual spot by the living room window. The summer rain from yesterday had left everything looking washed clean. The flowers in Eleanor's garden, now largely tended by Sarah, vibrant against the rich brown earth. Eleanor had loved gardening, coaxing reluctant plants into magnificent blooms through sheer determination and patience. "You just need to speak their language, Frank," she'd say, hands deep in soil. "Every living thing wants to thrive. Sometimes they just need a little help finding their way." The memory was so vivid that Frank half turned, expecting to see her there. Instead, there was only the empty room, the grandfather clock ticking away seconds that meant less and less to him as time passed. By mid-afternoon, grey clouds had gathered again, bringing with them a steady drizzle that tapped gently against the windows. Frank dozed in his chair, old age and medication making these impromptu naps a regular part of his day. He awoke to a strange sound, a scratching at the front door, followed by a low whine. Not Sarah's usual knock, nor the delivery person who occasionally brought groceries ordered by his nephew Mike. Frank got up slowly, joints stiff from sitting too long. The scratching continued, more insistent now. Using his cane for support, he made his way to the front door and peered through the peephole. Nothing was visible at eye level. The scratching came again, and Frank looked down to see a large brown shape on his porch. Curiosity overcoming caution, he opened the door a crack. There on his doorstep sat the biggest dog Frank had ever seen, a pit bull with tawny brown fur matted from the rain. The animal looked up at him with intelligent amber eyes that seemed to hold a universe of pain and resilience. Its ribs were clearly visible beneath its skin, and several scars marked its broad face and muscular shoulders. Despite its imposing size and obvious strength, the dog's posture was submissive, almost apologetic. "Well, hello there," Frank said, opening the door wider. "Where did you come from?" The dog whined softly, its tail sweeping a hesitant arc across the wet porch. Frank had never owned a dog. Eleanor had been allergic, but he'd always liked animals. This one looked like it had seen the worst humanity had to offer, and somehow survived. "You're soaking wet," Frank observed, "and hungry too by the looks of it." The dog's ears perked up at the word hungry. Frank hesitated only briefly before making a decision that would change the course of his remaining years. "Come on in then. Can't leave you out in this weather." The pit bull rose cautiously and limped into Frank's hallway, its nails clicking against the hardwood floor. Up close, the evidence of neglect and probable abuse was even more apparent. Old scars crisscrossed its body, and a more recent wound on its right hind leg explained the limp. "Let's get you dried off," Frank said, retrieving a towel from the hall closet. To his surprise, the large dog stood perfectly still, allowing him to gently wipe away the rainwater from its powerful frame. "You need a name," Frank mused as he worked. "Something strong for a strong dog." He thought for a moment, then nodded decisively. "Zeus, how's that sound? King of the gods seems fitting for a fellow like you." The newly christened Zeus responded with a soft woof that Frank chose to interpret as approval. In the kitchen, Frank rummaged through his refrigerator and found some leftover chicken from the meal Sarah had brought earlier in the week. He placed it in a bowl on the floor. Zeus approached cautiously, looking at Frank as if asking permission. "Go ahead, boy, it's for you." Zeus needed no further encouragement, devouring the chicken with the desperate efficiency of an animal accustomed to going hungry. While the dog ate, Frank filled another bowl with water, his movements more purposeful than they had been in months. There was something about having another living creature in the house, one that needed him, that pushed back the fog of his condition, however temporarily. After eating, Zeus settled onto the kitchen floor, his large head resting on outstretched paws, watching Frank with unwavering attention. Frank found himself talking to the dog as he moved around the house, narrating his actions in a way he hadn't done since Eleanor's passing. "I should probably call animal control," Frank told Zeus as he washed the few dishes in the sink. "You might belong to someone, though those scars tell me whoever had you before doesn't deserve to get you back." Zeus's ears flattened slightly at the words "animal control," as if he understood. "Then again," Frank continued, "my memory isn't what it used to be. Might forget to make that call. Would that be all right with you?" Zeus thumped his tail against the floor. When Sarah arrived for her regular afternoon visit, she was startled to find a massive pit bull lounging in Frank's living room, head resting comfortably on the old man's foot. "Frank Wilson, what on earth?" she exclaimed, freezing in the doorway. "Sarah, meet Zeus," Frank said with more animation than she'd seen from him in months. "He showed up on my porch about 3 hours ago." "And you just let him in?" Sarah's voice rose an octave. "That dog must weigh 90 pounds, and he's clearly been in fights. Look at those scars." Zeus raised his head, regarding Sarah with calm assessment before letting out a soft whine that sounded almost like a greeting. "He's gentle as a lamb," Frank insisted. "Hasn't made a wrong move since he got here. I think he was somebody's fighting dog that either escaped or got dumped when he wouldn't fight anymore." Sarah approached cautiously, her initial fear giving way to professional assessment. Before retirement, she'd worked as a veterinary assistant and recognized the signs of dogfighting abuse. "You're probably right," she admitted, kneeling slowly to examine Zeus more closely. "These are definitely fight scars, and old ones too. But Frank, you can't keep a dog like this, not with your situation." Frank's face fell, the brief animation fading. "My situation? You mean because I'm losing my mind, bit by bit?" "That's not what I meant," Sarah backpedaled, though they both knew it was exactly what she meant. "It's just a dog this size needs walks, regular feeding, vet care. He might even have health issues we can't see." "I can still take care of things," Frank said stubbornly. "I've been on my own for 5 years. With help," Sarah reminded him gently. "More and more help lately." They fell into uncomfortable silence, broken only by Zeus's soft breathing. The dog looked between them as if following their conversation. Finally, Sarah sighed. "Let me at least check him over properly." "Check. If you're determined to keep him, we should make sure he's not injured beyond what we can see." For the next half hour, Sarah gave Zeus a thorough examination while Frank watched anxiously. To everyone's surprise, Zeus cooperated perfectly, allowing Sarah to check his teeth, ears, and even the sensitive areas around his old wounds. "Well, apart from being underweight and having these old scars, he seems remarkably healthy," Sarah concluded. "No fleas that I can see, though he could use a proper bath. His teeth look good. I'd guess he's about 4 or 5 years old." "So I can keep him?" Frank asked, sounding more like an eager child than a man nearing 80. Sarah looked from Frank to Zeus and back again. Something about the tableau they presented, the lonely old man and the battle-scarred dog, touched her deeply. "Let's try it for a few days," she said cautiously. "I'll bring over some proper dog food and a bed. If it doesn't work out, my cousin runs a rescue for difficult-to-place dogs. He could take Zeus." Frank nodded, though they both knew he had no intention of giving up his new companion. That evening, after Sarah had left with a promise to return the next day with supplies, Frank and Zeus settled into a companionable routine that felt surprisingly natural. When it came time for bed, Zeus followed Frank into the bedroom and laid down beside the bed, positioning himself between Frank and the door as if standing guard. "Good night, Zeus," Frank said, reaching down to pat the dog's broad head. "Good night, Eleanor," he added, touching the photograph on his nightstand. For the first time in years, Frank fell asleep without the crushing weight of loneliness pressing down on his chest. On the floor beside him, Zeus kept vigilant watch, his scarred face noble in the moonlight streaming through the window, his amber eyes alert to any sound that might disturb his new human's rest. Outside, the rain had stopped completely, leaving behind a sky clearer than it had been in weeks. Stars winked down on the small house, where two damaged souls had found each other against all odds, neither aware of how profoundly their lives had just changed or of the remarkable journey that lay ahead of them. The first rays of morning sunlight filtered through Frank's bedroom curtains, casting gentle patterns across the floor. For once, he awoke not to disorienting confusion, but to the steady rhythm of Zeus's breathing beside the bed. The events of the previous day came back to him with unusual clarity. The rain, the scratching at the door, the hungry dog on his porch. "Morning, Zeus," Frank said, his voice rough with sleep. Zeus immediately lifted his head, amber eyes alert and attentive. The dog stood, stretching his powerful body, before padding over to rest his chin on the edge of Frank's mattress, tail wagging in gentle arcs. "You're still here," Frank murmured, reaching out to scratch behind the dog's ears. "Thought I might have dreamed you up." These days, the line between memory and imagination often blurred for Frank. Sometimes he'd recall conversations with Eleanor that couldn't possibly have happened after her passing, or he'd search frantically for objects he'd never owned. But Zeus was real, solid and warm under his palm, grounding him to the present moment in a way nothing had for years. With Zeus watching his every move, Frank felt a new sense of purpose as he went through his morning routine. He took his time in the bathroom, carefully following the checklist on the mirror. When he reached for his pill organizer, he found it empty. "Did I take these already?" he wondered aloud, a familiar panic rising in his chest. Zeus whined softly and nudged Frank's hand with his nose, drawing the old man's attention to the kitchen counter where the pills sat untouched. Frank released a relieved breath. "Good boy," he said, patting Zeus's head. "Keeping me straight already, are you?" After taking his medication with breakfast, Frank faced the question of what to do with his new companion. Zeus needed to go outside, but Frank's backyard wasn't fenced. Before he could worry too much, the dog padded to the back door and waited patiently. "You want to go out?" Frank asked. "Promise not to run off?" Zeus's steady gaze seemed to convey understanding. Frank opened the door hesitantly, watching as Zeus limped into the yard, made a quick circuit of the perimeter, took care of his business, and promptly returned to the door. "Well, I'll be," Frank chuckled. "Seems like you're a man of your word." By mid-morning, Sarah arrived with the promised supplies: a large bag of premium dog food, a plush dog bed, a collar, a leash, and various grooming tools. "I see your houseguest is still here," she said, eyeing Zeus, who sat calmly at Frank's feet. "Where else would he be?" Frank replied, helping her unload the items from her car. Sarah smiled at the change in Frank's demeanor. For months, he'd been withdrawing further into himself, his speech becoming more hesitant, his movements more tentative. Today, there was a spark in his eyes that had been missing for too long. "Let's get him cleaned up properly," Sarah suggested. "Those old wounds need some attention, and a bath wouldn't hurt either." What followed was an unexpectedly joyful hour in Frank's backyard. Using a garden hose with warm water, they carefully washed Zeus, who stood stoically through the entire process. His true coat color emerged, not just brown, but a rich brindle pattern with hints of gold that gleamed in the sunlight. As they worked, Frank told Sarah about his morning, including how Zeus had seemed to remind him about his medication. "That's interesting," Sarah said, gently working shampoo into Zeus's coat. "Some dogs have a natural instinct for when something's wrong. My cousin's rescue has placed a few service dogs with people who have various medical conditions." "You think Zeus could be one of those?" Frank asked, holding the hose steady. "Not officially, no. Service dogs receive specialized training, but animals are intuitive, especially intelligent ones like Zeus appears to be. They can pick up on subtle cues we might not even realize we're giving." After the bath, Zeus looked transformed, his coat shining, his powerful build more evident now that the dirt and matting were gone. Sarah treated his healing wound with antibiotic ointment and pronounced him remarkably healthy, all things considered. Before leaving, Sarah helped Frank set up Zeus's new bed in the living room, though both suspected it would remain unused given the dog's apparent preference for sleeping beside Frank's bed. "I've made an appointment with Dr. Rivera at Oak Ridge Veterinary Clinic for tomorrow at 2, Sarah told Frank, writing it on his calendar. "I'll drive you both. And Frank, try to remember that even if Zeus helps you, he's still your responsibility." Frank nodded, though his attention was already shifting to Zeus, who had spotted a squirrel through the window and was watching it with intense concentration. Over the next few days, Frank and Zeus fell into a comfortable routine. Zeus proved to be not only well-behaved, but almost preternaturally attuned to Frank's needs. When Frank would stand staring into the refrigerator, having forgotten what he was looking for, Zeus would nudge him gently, breaking the confusion. When Frank misplaced his glasses, Zeus would find them, even if they were in another room entirely. Most remarkably, Zeus seemed to sense when Frank was having a bad day. Those increasingly frequent times when memories slipped away like water through his fingers, when familiar objects became strange, when panic threatened to overwhelm him. On those days, Zeus stayed especially close, his solid presence a constant in Frank's shifting reality. The visits to Dr. Rivera confirmed what Sarah had suspected. Zeus had indeed been a fighting dog, his scars and old injuries telling a story of cruelty and neglect, but the vet was impressed by his gentle temperament. "Some dogs subjected to this kind of treatment become permanently aggressive," Dr. Rivera explained as she completed her examination. "Zeus has a remarkable capacity for trust, considering what he's been through." "We're alike that way," Frank said quietly, one gnarled hand resting on Zeus's head. "Both been through some rough patches, both still hanging in there." Dr. Rivera's expression softened. "Well, you've found each other now, and that's a good thing for both of you." Word of Frank's unusual new companion spread quickly through the small community of Oak Ridge. Neighbors who had previously interacted with Frank only in passing now found excuses to stop by, ostensibly to meet Zeus, but often staying to chat with Frank, drawn in by the animation that had returned to his weathered face when he spoke about his dog. Even Mike, Frank's nephew, who visited monthly out of duty more than connection, seemed surprised by the change in his uncle during his next visit. "He actually remembered my name this time," Mike told Sarah afterward on the porch, his voice low. "And he asked about Jenna and the kids. Haven't had a conversation that normal with him in over a year." Sarah nodded. That dog has been better medicine than anything Dr. Peterson prescribed. It's like having someone depending on him has given Frank a reason to stay present. Inside, Frank was showing Zeus a wooden bird he'd carved years ago, one of many that decorated his mantelpiece. "I used to make one of these every winter," he told Zeus, who watched attentively, head tilted as if absorbing every word. "Eleanor would paint them sometimes. She had a steadier hand than me for the fine details." Frank moved to place the carving back on the mantel but fumbled, his arthritic fingers failing to maintain their grip. Before the wooden bird could hit the floor, Zeus lunged forward, catching it gently in his mouth. He presented it back to Frank, tail wagging, clearly pleased with himself. "Well, I'll be," Frank chuckled, carefully taking the undamaged carving. "You're just full of surprises, aren't you?" Later that evening, as Frank prepared for bed, he talked to Eleanor's photograph as he always did. But the conversation had changed. "You should see this dog, Ellie," he said, smiling as Zeus settled into his now customary spot beside the bed. "Smart as a whip and gentle as a lamb, despite everything he's been through. Reminds me a bit of you, actually. That same resilience, that same kindness." Frank placed the photograph back on the nightstand and turned out the light. In the darkness, he reached down to pat Zeus's head. "Good night, boy," he murmured. "Thanks for finding me." Zeus shifted closer, his warm body pressing against the side of the bed, his steady breathing a comforting rhythm in the quiet room. As days turned into weeks, the partnership between man and dog deepened. Zeus became Frank's shadow, rarely more than a few feet away, his amber eyes constantly monitoring his human companion. For his part, Frank found that caring for Zeus gave structure to his days. Regular feeding times, short walks around the neighborhood, which grew longer as Zeus's limp improved. Grooming sessions that helped Frank's arthritic hands stay nimble. Most importantly, Zeus gave Frank someone to talk to, a living audience for the stories and memories that might otherwise have remained locked inside his increasingly unreliable mind. Though Zeus couldn't respond in words, his attentive presence encouraged Frank to keep reaching for memories, to keep making connections between past and present. "This is where Eleanor and I had our first picnic in Oak Ridge," Frank would say during their walks in the local park. Or, "That bakery makes cinnamon rolls almost as good as Eleanor's, though I'd never tell her that." Through these one-sided conversations, Frank kept Eleanor's memory alive while simultaneously strengthening his connection to the present world, a world that had seemed increasingly irrelevant until a scarred pit bull had scratched at his door on a rainy afternoon. Neither Frank nor Zeus could know what lay ahead, the challenges they would face together, the lives they would touch, the remarkable journey that was just beginning. But in those early weeks, as summer began its slow transition toward fall, they built the foundation of a bond that would prove stronger than memory, more enduring than pain, and more transformative than either could have imagined. Autumn arrived in Oak Ridge with a spectacular display of color. The maples lining Frank Street transformed into towers of crimson and gold, and mornings dawned crisp and cool. For Frank and Zeus, fall brought new routines. Their walks now included shuffling through piles of fallen leaves, Zeus occasionally pouncing on particularly crunchy specimens, making Frank laugh in a way he hadn't in years. On one such morning in late October, they were returning from their walk when Frank spotted Maggie Reynolds, the elementary school principal, herding a group of children toward the small community garden 2 blocks from his house. "Field trip day," Frank remarked to Zeus, who watched the children with interest, his tail wagging gently. "Eleanor used to volunteer at that garden, teaching kids about plants. She had a way with children that I never quite managed." Maggie noticed them and waved. "Mr. Wilson, good morning." To Frank's surprise, she guided her group toward them. He tensed slightly. He'd grown wary of social interactions as his condition progressed, fearful of forgetting names or losing his train of thought mid-conversation. "Class, this is Mr. Wilson and his dog," Maggie introduced them. "Mr. Wilson has lived in Oak Ridge longer than any of you have been alive." The children, about 20 first graders, gazed at Frank with undisguised curiosity. Then their attention shifted to Zeus, who sat calmly at Frank's side. "Is your dog friendly?" a small boy with glasses asked. Frank hesitated. Zeus had never shown any aggression, but he was still a powerful animal with a traumatic past. Before he could answer, Maggie interjected. "Remember what we discussed about asking before petting any animal," she reminded the children. And some dogs prefer quiet greetings. He's friendly, Frank said finally. But yes, he likes it when people are calm around him. His name is Zeus. Like the Greek god? A girl with braids asked, impressing Frank with her knowledge. Exactly like that, Frank smiled, because he's strong and brave. The children seemed fascinated by this connection. Under Maggie's careful supervision, they were allowed to approach Zeus one at a time, offering their hands for him to sniff before gently petting his head or back. Zeus remained perfectly composed, his amber eyes gentle as he accepted their attention. What happened next took everyone by surprise. A little girl with Down syndrome, who had been hanging back shyly, finally approached. Instead of simply petting Zeus, she wrapped her arms around his neck in an impulsive hug. Several adults gasped, but Zeus merely closed his eyes and leaned slightly into her embrace, as if understanding her need for this deeper connection. "Lucy, sweetie, remember what we said about respecting the dog's space," Maggie said gently, moving to separate them. "It's all right," Frank assured her, watching the interaction with wonder. Zeus seems quite content. When Lucy finally released Zeus and rejoined her classmates, the dog gave her hand a gentle lick, eliciting delighted giggles from the entire group. After the children continued to the garden, Maggie lingered. "That was remarkable," she said. "Most dogs wouldn't be so patient, especially with their history." "His history?" Frank asked, suddenly alert. Maggie's expression shifted to one of embarrassment. "I'm sorry. I assumed you knew. There was an article in the Oak Ridge Gazette last year about a dogfighting ring that was broken up outside of town. Several dogs were rescued, but one escaped during the raid. From the description and the timing, I thought Zeus might be that dog." Frank looked down at Zeus, who gazed back at him steadily. "We've never really known where he came from. He just showed up on my porch one rainy day." "Well, wherever he came from, he's clearly found the right place now," Maggie said warmly. "Would you and Zeus consider visiting the school sometime? We have a reading program where children practice by reading to dogs. It helps with their confidence." The old Frank would have declined immediately, anxious about his mental lapses. But 3 months with Zeus had given him a new confidence. "We'd like that," he heard himself say. As they walked home, Frank pondered this new information about Zeus's past. It explained the scars, the initial wariness, but it made the dog's gentle nature all the more remarkable. "You've had it rough, haven't you, boy?" he murmured, resting his hand on Zeus's broad head. "But you didn't let it make you mean." That evening, as Frank prepared their dinner, stew for himself, premium kibble mixed with some lean meat for Zeus, he felt an unusual heaviness in his chest. He dismissed it as indigestion, or perhaps the emotional weight of learning more about Zeus's difficult past. By bedtime, however, the discomfort had increased, spreading to his left arm and jaw. Frank sat on the edge of his bed, breathing heavily, sweat beading on his forehead despite the cool autumn air flowing through the partially open window. Zeus paced anxiously at his feet, whining softly. "Just need to rest," Frank muttered, lying down without changing into his pajamas. The pain intensified, a vice tightening around his chest. Zeus's whining grew more urgent and he pawed at Frank's leg. "It's okay, boy," Frank gasped, reaching for the phone on his nightstand. His fingers fumbled with the buttons. Who was he trying to call? Sarah? His nephew? The doctor? The numbers swam before his eyes and the phone slipped from his grasp, clattering to the floor. Zeus barked sharply, something he rarely did. When Frank didn't respond, the dog's behavior changed dramatically. He ran to the bedroom window, which was partially open to let in the cool autumn air. With a determined leap, Zeus pushed his body against the screen, tearing it from its frame. The pain caused him to yelp, but he squeezed through the opening, ignoring the cuts from the torn metal edges. Frank was dimly aware of Zeus's disappearance, but the crushing pain in his chest consumed his attention. The room spun around him. Eleanor's photograph on the nightstand, the last thing he saw before darkness claimed him. Zeus landed heavily on the ground outside, shaking himself before racing across the lawn towards Sarah Finley's house. The porch light was still on, though it was nearly midnight. Zeus barked frantically, scratching at her door, his powerful voice shattering the night's silence. Inside, Sarah jolted awake in her recliner where she'd fallen asleep watching television. The frantic barking registered immediately as unusual. Zeus was typically a quiet dog. She hurried to the door. "Zeus, what on earth?" Her question died as she took in the dog's agitated state and the blood on his shoulder from the window screen. Immediately, she understood something was terribly wrong. "Frank, is it Frank?" she asked, grabbing her phone and keys. Zeus barked once, then turned and ran back toward Frank's house, pausing to ensure she was following. Sarah hurried after him, her heart pounding. She'd been a nurse's aide before becoming a veterinary assistant, and she recognized the signs of an emergency when she saw them. Zeus led her directly to the open window, barking urgently. "I'll go through the front door," Sarah called to him, rushing around to the porch. The door was unlocked, as Frank often forgot to secure it. She pushed inside, calling his name, following Zeus, who had raced back through the house to lead her to the bedroom. She found Frank unconscious on the bed, his color ashen, his breathing shallow and labored. Years of medical training kicked in immediately. She dialed 911, speaking clearly to the dispatcher. Suspected heart attack at 1427 Maple Street. Male, 78 years old, unconscious but breathing. History of Alzheimer's. "Please hurry." While waiting for the ambulance, Sarah did what she could, loosening Frank's collar, checking his pulse, positioning him properly on the bed. Throughout it all, Zeus remained at Frank's side, occasionally nuzzling his hand as if trying to wake him. The ambulance arrived within minutes, sirens piercing the quiet neighborhood. The paramedics worked efficiently, attaching monitors, administering oxygen, preparing Frank for transport. "His dog broke through a window screen to get help," Sarah explained to one of the medics. "If not for Zeus, I wouldn't have known anything was wrong until morning." The paramedic glanced at Zeus, who watched the proceedings with intense focus. "Smart dog," he commented as they loaded Frank onto the stretcher. "Probably saved his life." "Can I follow in my car?" Sarah asked. "There's no family nearby. And the dog? Meet us at Memorial. We'll take good care of him," the paramedic assured her as they wheeled Frank out. Sarah knelt beside Zeus, examining his injured shoulder. "You're hurt, boy, but it doesn't look too deep. Let me clean you up before we go to the hospital." Zeus allowed her to quickly rinse and bandage his wound, though his attention remained fixed on the door where Frank had disappeared. As soon as Sarah grabbed Frank's medication list and insurance card from the kitchen drawer, Zeus was at the front door, clearly understanding they were going to follow Frank. The waiting room at Oak Ridge Memorial Hospital was nearly empty at that late hour. Sarah settled into an uncomfortable plastic chair, Zeus lying at her feet, both watching the double doors to the emergency department with anxious anticipation. "Family of Frank Wilson," a nurse called after what seemed like hours but was closer to 40 minutes. Sarah stood. "I'm his neighbor and emergency contact. His only family is a nephew who lives 3 hours away." The nurse eyed Zeus dubiously. "The dog can't come back." "He saved Frank's life tonight," Sarah said firmly, "and he's exceptionally well behaved." After a moment's hesitation, the nurse nodded. "Dr. Patel wants to speak with you." "This way." They followed her to a small consultation room where a doctor in scrubs waited, his expression serious but not grim, a distinction Sarah recognized from years of working adjacent to medical professionals. "Ms. Finley, I'm Dr. Patel. Mr. Wilson has suffered a significant cardiac event, a heart attack. We've stabilized him and are preparing him for a procedure to place a stent in one of his coronary arteries that's severely blocked. Will he recover?" Sarah asked, her hand automatically dropping to Zeus's head for comfort. "His chances are good, given how quickly he received medical attention." Dr. Patel's gaze dropped to Zeus. "I understand we have this fellow to thank for that." The paramedics mentioned his rather heroic actions. Zeus sat stoically, as if understanding he was being discussed. "The next 24 hours will be critical," Dr. Patel continued, "but Mr. Wilson is showing promising responsiveness. The procedure should begin within the hour. Do you have contact information for his family?" Sarah provided Mike's number, then asked, "When can we see him?" "He'll be in recovery, then intensive care. You can see him briefly tomorrow morning, but he'll likely be sedated." Dr. Patel hesitated. "I should mention that the combination of the cardiac event and his Alzheimer's may complicate his recovery. Unfamiliar environments often exacerbate confusion in patients with dementia." Sarah nodded, understanding the implied concern. Frank might wake up not knowing where he was or why, potentially compromising his recovery. "I'll be there," she promised. "And if possible, Zeus should be too. He has a remarkable calming effect on Frank." Dr. Patel looked skeptical but didn't argue. "We'll see what can be arranged. For now, I suggest you both get some rest. We have your contact information and will call immediately if there's any change." In the parking lot, Sarah faced a dilemma. She couldn't take Zeus to her house. Her elderly cat wouldn't tolerate the intrusion. Taking him back to Frank's empty home seemed cruel. After a moment's consideration, she drove to both houses, collecting Zeus's food and bed from Frank's and her overnight necessities from her own. "We'll stay at Frank's tonight," she told Zeus as they returned to the silent house. "It'll be better for both of us." Zeus seemed to understand, settling onto his bed in Frank's living room, while Sarah made up the guest room. Before turning in, she called Mike, waking him to explain the situation. He promised to drive down in the morning. As Sarah tried to sleep in the unfamiliar bed, she heard the click of Zeus's nails on the hardwood floor. He appeared in the doorway, whining softly. "You can come in," she said, patting the edge of the bed. Zeus approached cautiously, then settled on the floor beside her. His head resting on his paws, amber eyes fixed on the bedroom door as if expecting Frank to walk through it at any moment. "He'll be okay," Sarah whispered, trying to convince herself as much as Zeus. "You did good, Zeus, really good." Outside, the autumn wind rustled through the maple trees, sending a shower of crimson leaves against the window. Inside, woman and dog kept vigil, united in their concern for the man who had become the center of both their worlds, neither knowing what challenges the coming days would bring, but both determined to face them together. The fluorescent lights of Oak Ridge Memorial Hospital cast harsh shadows across the intensive care unit where Frank lay, connected to a network of monitors and tubes. The stent procedure had been successful, Dr. Patel explained to Sarah and Mike the following morning, but Frank remained sedated, his body needing time to recover from both the trauma of the heart attack and the invasive medical intervention. "When will he wake up?" Mike asked, standing awkwardly at the foot of his uncle's bed. At 42, Mike Wilson bore a faint resemblance to what Frank must have looked like decades earlier. The same strong jawline, the same crinkles around the eyes when he smiled. But where Frank's face had been weathered by life's hardships into something dignified and kind, Mike's features held a perpetual tension, a man always rushing to the next appointment. "We're beginning to reduce the sedation now," Dr. Patel explained. "He could regain consciousness any time in the next few hours. However, I must caution you both, between the cardiac event, the medication, and his pre-existing cognitive condition, he may experience increased confusion upon waking." Sarah nodded, understanding. His Alzheimer's had been relatively stable these past few months, but stress can accelerate symptoms, can't it? "Unfortunately, yes," Dr. Patel confirmed. "Hospital environments in particular can trigger what we call hospital delirium in patients with dementia, disorientation, agitation, sometimes even hallucinations." Mike checked his watch surreptitiously, already calculating how long he'd need to stay before he could reasonably return to his own life 3 hours away. Sarah noticed but said nothing, focusing instead on Frank's pale face, the oxygen cannula in his nose, the steady beep of the cardiac monitor tracking each beat of his damaged but resilient heart. "I've arranged to take time off work," she said. "I can stay with him during visiting hours, help keep him oriented." "That would be extremely beneficial," Dr. Patel agreed. "Familiar faces and voices are the best anchors for patients like Mr. Wilson." "What about Zeus?" Sarah asked. "Frank's dog. They're inseparable. Would it be possible to arrange a visit once Frank is more stable? I truly believe seeing Zeus would help his recovery." Dr. Patel looked hesitant. Hospital policy generally prohibits animals, except for certified service dogs. "Zeus essentially functions as one," Sarah argued. "He alerts when Frank forgets his medication, finds things he misplaces, keeps him oriented. And he literally saved Frank's life 2 nights ago." Mike, who had met Zeus during his monthly visits, but never fully appreciated the bond between his uncle and the dog, seemed surprised by Sarah's vehemence. "Is this dog really that important to Uncle Frank?" he asked. "You have no idea," Sarah replied. "Since Zeus arrived, your uncle has been more present, more engaged with the world around him. The dog gives him purpose, a reason to stay connected." Dr. Patel considered this. "Let me speak with hospital administration. If Mr. Wilson's recovery proceeds well, perhaps we can arrange a brief visit in a controlled setting. But first, we need him conscious and stable." They didn't have to wait long. Shortly after Mike left to get coffee from the cafeteria, Frank's eyelids fluttered. Sarah leaned forward, taking his hand gently. "Frank, it's Sarah. You're in the hospital. You had a heart attack, but you're going to be okay." Frank's eyes opened slowly, cloudy with medication and confusion. He looked around the room without recognition, his gaze sliding past Sarah as if she weren't there. "Eleanor?" he called weakly, his voice rough from the breathing tube that had been removed earlier that morning. "Where's Eleanor?" Sarah's heart sank. This was what they had feared. The combination of medical trauma and Alzheimer's causing Frank to slip back in time, to forget not only recent events, but the painful reality that Eleanor had been gone for years. "Frank, it's Sarah," she repeated gently. "Your neighbor. Eleanor isn't here." Frank's expression crumpled. "She's gone shopping. I need to tell her something important." "Eleanor passed away 5 years ago, Frank," Sarah said quietly, hating the need to remind him of this loss, but knowing that orientation to reality, however painful, was important. "But you're not alone. Zeus is waiting for you at home, and I'm here with you now." "Zeus?" Frank repeated, the name stirring something in his foggy consciousness. "My dog?" "Yes, your dog," Sarah confirmed, relieved to see this connection still intact. "The brown pit bull who's been living with you for the past few months. He's the one who got help when you had your heart attack. He broke through the window screen to come get me." Frank's brow furrowed with concentration. "Big dog, amber eyes." "That's right," Sarah encouraged. "He's staying at your house waiting for you to come home." A tear slipped down Frank's weathered cheek. "I remember him, but everything else is jumbled." "That's normal after what you've been through," Sarah assured him. "The important memories will come back as you recover." Mike returned with coffee to find his uncle awake but disoriented. After a brief, awkward conversation, during which Frank repeatedly confused Mike with a colleague from his construction days, the younger Wilson made his excuses. "I should head back," he told Sarah in the hallway. "The kids have soccer, and Jenna can't take time off work this week. Will you call me with updates?" "Of course," Sarah promised, managing to keep the disappointment from her voice. "Drive safely." Back in Frank's room, the older man had drifted into a natural sleep. Sarah settled into the chair beside his bed, prepared for the long vigil ahead. The next 3 days established a pattern. Frank would wake, sometimes clear-headed enough to understand his situation, other times lost in confusion, calling for Eleanor or asking about his parents, who had been gone for decades. Sarah remained his constant, patiently reorienting him each time he slipped away, celebrating the increasingly frequent moments of clarity. Zeus, meanwhile, had become a neighborhood project. Various residents of Maple Street took turns walking him, feeding him, spending time with him so he wouldn't be alone in Frank's empty house. The story of his brave rescue had spread through Oak Ridge, transforming him from "that fighting dog Mr. Wilson took in" to a local hero. On the 4th day, Dr. Patel declared Frank stable enough to be moved from intensive care to a regular room. His heart was responding well to medication, and the stent was functioning properly. "I've spoken with administration about your request," he told Sarah. "They're willing to allow a brief visit from Zeus, provided it takes place in the garden courtyard rather than inside the hospital building. We'll need documentation of his vaccinations and a guarantee that he'll be controlled at all times. I can have his vet records faxed over immediately," Sarah said, already mentally composing the text she would send to Dr. Rivera. "And Zeus is exceptionally well behaved. This will mean the world to Frank." Later that afternoon, Frank sat in a wheelchair in the hospital's small garden courtyard, a blanket tucked around his legs despite the mild autumn weather. His physical weakness frustrated him, but even more disturbing was the mental fog that continued to come and go, leaving him unsure of which memories were recent and which belonged to decades past. "Sarah says Zeus is coming," he told the nurse who had helped him outside, trying to sound confident, though privately he wasn't entirely sure who Zeus was. The name triggered feelings of warmth and affection, but the details remained tantalizingly out of reach. "Your heroic dog," the nurse replied with a smile. "Everyone's been talking about him." Frank nodded as if he understood perfectly, unwilling to admit the extent of his confusion. The garden gate opened, and Sarah appeared holding the leash of a large brindle pit bull. The moment Frank saw the dog, it was as if a curtain lifted. "Zeus!" he cried, his voice stronger than it had been since his hospitalization. Zeus strained at the leash, pulling Sarah forward until she released him to approach Frank. The dog moved with uncharacteristic gentleness, seeming to understand Frank's fragility. Instead of jumping up in excitement, he placed his head carefully on Frank's knee, amber eyes fixed on his human's face with unconcealed devotion. Frank's hands trembled as he stroked the broad head, tears streaming unashamedly down his face. "You saved me, didn't you, boy?" he whispered. "Sarah told me what you did." Zeus whined softly, nuzzling closer. The connection between them was palpable, a current of understanding that transcended the need for words. From the sidelines, Dr. Patel watched with professional interest. He'd worked with Alzheimer's patients throughout his career and had seen how the disease could strip away layers of identity until only a shadow remained. Yet here was Frank Wilson, a man who had been largely incoherent just hours earlier, now fully present and engaged, anchored by the presence of his dog. "I didn't fully believe you," he admitted to Sarah, "but seeing them together, it's remarkable." "Zeus doesn't just help him remember," Sarah explained. "He gives Frank a reason to remember, a reason to stay connected to the present." The visit lasted only 20 minutes, hospital policy being inflexible despite the obvious therapeutic benefit. As Zeus was led away, Frank's clarity began to recede again, but not completely. Something fundamental had been reinforced by the reunion, a tether to his true self that helped him hold on through the disorienting days that followed. Frank remained in the hospital for another week, his physical recovery progressing steadily, even as his mental state fluctuated. Sometimes he recognized Sarah immediately, other times he called her Eleanor or didn't know her at all. The only constant was his response to Zeus, who was permitted to visit briefly every other day, each reunion triggering improvements in Frank's orientation and mood that lasted hours afterward. Dr. Rivera, Zeus's veterinarian, contributed to these visits, volunteering to transport Zeus to and from the hospital. She'd been so moved by the story of the rescue that she'd waived all fees for treating the cuts Zeus had sustained, breaking through the window screen. "In my 20 years of practice, I've seen remarkable bonds between humans and animals," she told Sarah during one visit. "But what Zeus and Frank have goes beyond companionship. It's as if they recognize something essential in each other, some shared resilience in the face of adversity." Finally, the day arrived for Frank's discharge. Dr. Patel reviewed the extensive list of medications and precautions with Sarah, who had agreed to stay at Frank's house temporarily to help with his transition home. "His cardiac recovery is proceeding well," Dr. Patel explained, "but his cognitive condition remains variable. He'll need consistent support for medication management, meal preparation, and monitoring for any cardiac symptoms." "I understand," Sarah assured him. "Between myself and our neighbors, we'll establish a rotation to make sure Frank is never alone until he's stronger. And of course, Zeus will be there." Dr. Patel smiled. "Yes, Zeus. I've added a note to Mr. Wilson's file about the therapeutic benefit of his relationship with his dog. Should he need hospitalization in the future, we'll try to accommodate more regular visits." The journey home felt momentous. Frank sat in the passenger seat of Sarah's car, gazing out at the familiar streets of Oak Ridge with the wonder of someone returning from a long journey. In the back seat, Zeus sat alertly, occasionally leaning forward to nuzzle Frank's shoulder, as if reassuring himself that his human was really coming home. As Sarah pulled into the driveway of the modest house on Maple Street, Frank felt a surge of emotion. "I wasn't sure I'd see this place again," he admitted. "Zeus made sure you would," Sarah replied, helping him from the car. The dog bounded ahead, waiting impatiently at the front door, tail wagging with unconcealed joy. Inside, Frank moved slowly through the rooms that had once again become unfamiliar during his absence. Zeus stayed close, occasionally pressing against his leg when Frank seemed particularly disoriented, guiding him back to the present moment with the solid reality of his presence. That evening, settled in his favorite chair with Zeus at his feet, Frank looked more peaceful than he had since the heart attack. Sarah bustled around the kitchen, preparing a heart-healthy dinner according to the dietitian's instructions, occasionally glancing into the living room to check on him. "You know," Frank said during dinner, speaking with unusual clarity, "when I was in the hospital, especially those first few days, I kept slipping away. Not just my memories, but me. It felt like I was disappearing into fog piece by piece." He looked down at Zeus, who lay beside his chair, But every time this fellow showed up, it was like he brought parts of me back with him." Sarah nodded, understanding. "The doctors were amazed by the difference in your coherence after his visits. It's not just the Alzheimer's," Frank continued thoughtfully. "It's been that way since he found me. Before Zeus, I was just waiting, not really living, just existing until the end came. He gave me a purpose again." "You gave each other purpose," Sarah corrected gently. "Two survivors helping each other heal." Frank smiled, a genuine expression that reached his eyes and momentarily erased the lingering fatigue of his ordeal. "I suppose we did." That night, as Frank prepared for bed, a process now complicated by new medications and the weakness left by his hospitalization, Zeus watched with attentive eyes, seemingly cataloging every movement, every potential difficulty. When Frank finally settled under the covers, Zeus took his customary position beside the bed, amber eyes gleaming in the darkness. "Good night, Zeus," Frank murmured, reaching down to touch the dog's head. "Thank you for bringing me home." Zeus shifted closer, resting his chin on the edge of the mattress, his steady presence a promise that whatever challenges lay ahead, Frank would not face them alone. In the quiet darkness of the bedroom, where Frank had nearly lost his life, man and dog renewed the unspoken covenant between them, a pledge of loyalty, protection, and unconditional acceptance that transcended words, memory, and even time itself. Outside, the maple trees had shed most of their brilliant foliage, their bare branches etched against the night sky, a reminder that even in seasons of loss, the promise of renewal remains. And in the small house on Maple Street, that promise was already being fulfilled, one heartbeat, one breath, one moment of connection at a time. Winter settled over Oak Ridge with gentle determination, transforming the landscape into a monochrome painting of whites and grays. 3 months had passed since Frank's heart attack, and his physical recovery had progressed better than anyone expected. The cardiac rehabilitation exercises, which he faithfully performed under Sarah's watchful eye, had restored much of his strength and stamina. His cognitive condition, however, remained a daily battle. Some mornings, Frank would wake fully present, remembering details from the previous day with remarkable clarity. Other mornings he would call for Eleanor or ask about events from decades past, as if they had just occurred. The one constant, regardless of his mental state, was Zeus. The dog had become Frank's anchor, his connection to the present moment, the living tether that pulled him back when his mind began to drift away. Zeus had developed an almost supernatural ability to anticipate Frank's needs. He would retrieve the pill organizer at medication times, bring Frank his shoes when it was time for their daily walk, and position himself as a stable support when Frank's balance faltered. Most remarkably, Zeus seemed to sense the onset of Frank's confused periods, sometimes even before they fully manifested, staying especially close during these vulnerable moments. "It's like he has a sixth sense," Dr. Peterson remarked during a home visit. The neurologist had been skeptical when Sarah first told him about Zeus's impact on Frank's condition, but seeing them together had converted him. There's emerging research about service animals for dementia patients, but what Zeus does instinctively goes beyond most formal training programs. The bond between man and dog had become something of a local legend in Oak Ridge. The story of Zeus's dramatic rescue had been featured in the town newspaper, accompanied by a photograph of Frank and Zeus sitting together on their front porch, the dog's scarred face resting contentedly on the old man's knee. The article had prompted an outpouring of community support, from neighbors who volunteered to shovel Frank's driveway after snowfalls to the local pharmacy that now delivered his medications free of charge. Most meaningful to Frank was the invitation from Oak Ridge Elementary to participate in their Reading with Rovers program. Twice a month, he and Zeus would visit the school, where children who struggled with reading would practice by reading aloud to Zeus. Frank would sit quietly beside his dog, occasionally helping with difficult words, but mostly allowing the children and Zeus to form their own connections. Lucy, the little girl with Down syndrome, who had hugged Zeus during their first encounter, became their most devoted reader. Her progress over the months had been remarkable, from halting single-word recognition to flowing sentences, all delivered to an attentive Zeus who seemed to understand the importance of his role as a non-judgmental listener. "Mr. Wilson," Lucy said one snowy afternoon as they prepared to leave the school, "was Zeus always so nice?" Frank considered the question with the seriousness it deserved. No, Lucy. He wasn't always nice because people weren't always nice to him. But he chose to be kind anyway. That's what makes him special. Lucy nodded sagely. Like how sometimes I get mad when kids are mean, but my mom says I should be kind anyway? Exactly like that, Frank agreed, touched by her insight. It's a brave thing to choose kindness, especially when you've known unkindness. These interactions at the school provided Frank with cognitive stimulation that his doctors believed was helping to slow the progression of his Alzheimer's. The responsibility of the visits gave structure to his weeks, and the children's unconditional acceptance eased his fear of making mistakes or losing his train of thought. As winter deepened, Sarah's temporary stay at Frank's house had evolved into a more permanent arrangement. She had moved her essential belongings into the guest room, renting her own house to a young couple new to Oak Ridge. The arrangement benefited everyone. Frank had the support he needed, Sarah no longer lived alone, and Zeus had 2 humans to adore him. They developed comfortable routines, dividing household tasks according to Frank's capabilities on any given day. On good days, he might prepare simple meals or fold laundry. On difficult days, when confusion clouded his mind, Sarah would gently redirect him to activities that soothed rather than frustrated, listening to music from his youth, sorting his collection of wooden birds, or simply sitting with Zeus in the winter sunshine that streamed through the living room windows. Frank's nephew Mike visited more regularly now, bringing his wife Jenna and their children, Ethan and Kayla, who had developed a special fondness for their great uncle and his heroic dog. The visits, which had once been tense obligations, became genuine family gatherings filled with laughter and connection. "Uncle Frank," Mike said during their January visit, "we've been thinking. The kids' spring break is in April. What if you, Sarah, and Zeus came to stay with us for a few days? We've got plenty of room, and there's a great park nearby for walks." In the past, Frank would have declined immediately, anxious about navigating unfamiliar surroundings with his condition, but his experiences over the past months, the hospital stay, the school visits, the growing circle of community support, had expanded his comfort zone considerably. "We'd like that," he said, surprising everyone, including himself. "As long as Zeus approves, of course." Zeus, hearing his name, thumped his tail against the floor in what everyone chose to interpret as enthusiastic consent. The winter months brought their challenges. Frank's heart condition, while stable, required constant monitoring and medication adjustments. His Alzheimer's continued its subtle progression, manifesting in new areas of difficulty. Following multi-step recipes that had once been second nature, remembering the names of newer acquaintances, finding the right words during conversations. Yet alongside these challenges came unexpected gifts. Frank's relationship with Zeus deepened daily, their communication transcending the need for words. Sarah's presence transformed from caregiving to genuine companionship, her practical nurse's assistant background balanced by her wry humor and bottomless patience. The community around them expanded, creating a safety net of support that eased the burden of Frank's conditions. Perhaps most profound was the change in Frank's perspective. Before Zeus, he had viewed his Alzheimer's diagnosis as a humiliating countdown to oblivion. Each forgotten name or misplaced object, another step toward the dissolution of his selfhood. Now, while he still mourned the gradually retreating shoreline of his memory, he had discovered that his essential self remained intact, even as details faded, his capacity for connection, for kindness, for purpose. "I used to think I was disappearing," he confided to Sarah one evening as they watched Zeus doze by the fireplace. "That one day there'd be nothing left of me but an empty shell. But that's not how it works, is it? The core of who I am, that stays." Sarah reached over to squeeze his hand. "That's what I see. The details might get fuzzy, but you're still you, Frank. Still the man who opened his door to a battle-scarred pit bull on a rainy day. Still the man who shows up for those kids at school even on your hardest days. Still the man Eleanor loved all those years." Frank nodded, his eyes misting slightly at the mention of Eleanor. "I think she would have loved Zeus, allergies notwithstanding." "I think she would have too," Sarah agreed. "And I think she'd be proud of how you faced all this." As February turned to March, the first hesitant signs of spring began to appear. Crocuses pushing through the melting snow, daylight extending its stay by precious minutes each evening, birds returning with their dawn symphonies. Frank, Zeus, and Sarah extended their daily walks, venturing beyond their immediate neighborhood to the community garden where Eleanor had once volunteered. The garden lay dormant still, waiting for warmer days, but volunteers had begun the spring preparations, clearing winter debris and turning soil in the raised beds. Among them was Maggie Reynolds, the elementary school principal who had first introduced Frank and Zeus to the Reading with Rovers program. "Mr. Wilson, Zeus, what a lovely surprise," she called, setting down her garden fork and crossing to the fence. "We're getting ready for planting season. The children will be starting seedlings in their classrooms next week." Frank leaned against the fence, Zeus a steady presence at his side. Eleanor loved this time of year in the garden, all that potential waiting just beneath the surface. Maggie's expression softened at the mention of Eleanor. Though she had arrived in Oak Ridge after Eleanor's passing, she had heard stories of the vibrant woman who had devoted countless hours to teaching children about growing things. "We still use many of her lesson plans," Maggie said. "Her influence lives on here." As they chatted, an idea began to form in Frank's mind, elusive at first, then gaining clarity with each moment. "Do you allow community volunteers in the garden?" he asked suddenly. "Of course. We always need help, especially from experienced gardeners." "I wouldn't be able to do much heavy work," Frank cautioned, "and sometimes my memory—" "We would welcome any contribution you could make," Maggie assured him. "And Zeus too. The children would love seeing him here." On the walk home, Frank was unusually quiet, his expression thoughtful. Sarah didn't press, having learned that Frank often needed time to process new ideas at his own pace. That evening, as they finished dinner, Frank finally shared what he'd been considering. "I'd like to volunteer at the garden, not every day, just maybe once a week. Eleanor would want me to." Sarah smiled. "I think that's a wonderful idea. It would be good for you to spend more time outdoors as the weather improves." "There's something else," Frank continued, his voice growing softer. "I've been thinking about Eleanor, about what she would want for this house after I'm gone. Mike and his family have their own place, and it would be impractical for them to keep this house just for occasional visits. Frank, you don't need to worry about—" He held up a hand gently. "Please, Sarah, this is important. I may not have much time left with a clear enough mind to make these decisions." Sarah nodded, allowing him to continue. "I've spoken with my lawyer. The house will go to Mike, of course, but with the understanding that it should be sold. The proceeds will be divided, part to Mike's family and part to establish a trust." "A trust?" Sarah echoed. "For Zeus," Frank explained, "to ensure he's always cared for, no matter what happens to me. And—" he hesitated, suddenly uncertain. "I'd like to name you as his guardian if you're willing. You've come to love him almost as much as I do." Sarah's eyes filled with tears. "Oh, Frank, of course I'm willing. But let's not get ahead of ourselves. You're doing well considering everything." "I am," Frank agreed. "Better than anyone expected. But I need to know that both of you will be taken care of when the time comes. Zeus saved my life in more ways than one. He deserves security for the rest of his." As spring fully established itself, Frank's garden volunteering became a highlight of his week. Under Maggie's guidance, he worked with small groups of children, teaching them the basics of gardening much as Eleanor once had. Zeus accompanied him, delighting the children with his gentle patience and seemingly endless tolerance for their attention. The garden project gave Frank a renewed sense of connection to Eleanor, not through grief or loss, but through continuation, carrying forward her passion for nurturing growth. On his clearest days, he could almost feel her presence beside him as he guided small hands in planting seeds or explained why earthworms were a gardener's best friends. By late April, Frank, Sarah, and Zeus had made their promised visit to Mike's family in Lancaster, a journey that had once seemed impossibly daunting, but that Frank navigated with surprising resilience. Zeus, as always, remained his steadfast companion, helping him orient to the unfamiliar surroundings and providing calm reassurance during moments of confusion. The visit proved transformative for everyone. Mike and Jenna witnessed firsthand the remarkable partnership between Frank and Zeus, gaining new appreciation for the complex person who remained despite the advancing Alzheimer's. Frank discovered that with adequate support, his world could expand beyond Oak Ridge. The children forged deeper bonds with their great-uncle, absorbing his gentleness, his patience, his quiet dignity in the face of difficult challenges. On their return to Oakridge, spring had fully blossomed. Eleanor's garden burst with color, tulips and daffodils creating bright islands amid the newly green landscape. Frank insisted on stopping to admire the display before entering the house. "She would love this," he said, gazing at the garden. "All this life coming back after the winter." Zeus pressed against his leg supportively, amber eyes alert and attentive as always. As they stood there in the gentle spring sunshine, Frank was struck by the journey they had traveled together. He and Zeus, two damaged souls who had found in each other the healing they both desperately needed. From that first rainy afternoon to this moment of quiet appreciation, they had transformed each other's lives in ways neither could have anticipated. Frank's memory would continue to fade. His heart, though stronger now, remained permanently damaged. Zeus's scars would never completely disappear, visible reminders of his difficult past. Yet in their imperfection, in their mutual brokenness, they had discovered something profound, that healing doesn't require wholeness, that purpose can emerge from pain, that love in its purest form asks only for presence, not perfection. As Frank turned toward the house, Zeus at his side and Sarah waiting on the porch, he felt a sense of completion, of having come full circle from the isolated existence he had endured before Zeus's arrival. The future remained uncertain, as all futures do, but it no longer loomed as a threatening shadow. Instead, it offered continued possibilities for connection, for meaning, for the quiet joy of days spent in the company of those who truly saw him. Not just the confusion or the forgetfulness, but the essential Frank Wilson who remained beneath it all. "Come on, boy," Frank said softly to Zeus. "Let's go home." Zeus wagged his tail and matched his pace perfectly to Frank's slower steps, the two of them moving forward together into whatever awaited, bound by a love that transcended words, a connection that defied explanation, and a loyalty that would endure beyond memory itself. Dear listeners, we hope that Frank and Zeus's journey has touched your hearts. Their story reminds us that healing and purpose can often come in unexpected forms, and that sometimes our greatest angels arrive with four paws and unconditional love. If this story moved you, please subscribe to our channel for more soul-stirring narratives that explore the depths of human connection and resilience. Leave a like to let us know you enjoyed it, and share your thoughts in the comments below, perhaps about a special animal that changed your life, or a moment when kindness came to you from an unexpected source. Our community thrives on these shared experiences, and every day we bring new stories that illuminate the complexity and beauty of life. Don't miss our upcoming content. Your next favorite story might be waiting just a click away. We'll see you in the comments.